Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of the Social Future of Australia, the 50th anniversary symposium of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia. My name is Mark Weston. I'm a member of the steering committee for this symposium. I'm also a fellow of the Academy and the director of the Institute for Social Science Research at the University of Queensland. We'd like to begin day 2 with a brief acknowledgement of country.
Wherever you are across Australia,
we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land.
The Darug peoples,
the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation,
the Gundungurra people of the Southern Highlands,
the Ngunnawal people of the Canberra region on whose country we are standing,
and all other peoples of this vast continent.
Their ongoing connection through custodianship of its land and waters,
physical and spiritual,
through culture, language and ceremony.
Where sovereignty was never ceded, we pay our respects to elders past, present and still to come.
I'd like to also acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Jagera and Turrbal country, the unceded lands of the Jagera and Turrbal country, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today. So my job is to make some brief opening comments just to set the day up. But before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge that we became aware with great sadness yesterday of the passing of Professor Stuart McIntyre. Stuart was a towering figure in Australian social science. He made monumental contributions to Australian history. He was the Ernest Scott Professor of History at the University of Melbourne, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts, and a former president of the Academy. And I personally was very privileged to host Stuart when he gave the Keith Hancock lecture a few years back on the poor relation, which is a history of the social sciences in Australia and the history of the Academy. So this is a sad day for all of us in the Academy, as it is for those of us across the social sciences. We will be doing something formally through the Academy to acknowledge his passing, but I did think it was important that we note it here today. All right, to begin the symposium, the event is going to be held as a series of webinars with breaks in between each session. The webinar will end after each session and you can basically rejoin at any time. So please check the program for the session and the break times. We hope you'll engage with the session and with the presenters, and we'd encourage you, if you have questions, to put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and that way we can make sure that we don't miss them. If you have comments you want to make, please use the chat box. And I'd encourage you to use the chat box now to tell us which country you are on. The sessions are being recorded and they will be made available after the event, and full speaker biographies are also available in the program. The link to the program will be sent through the chat now and it's available on our website. I also have a large truck driving past the outside of my house. I hope that that's not too distracting for you. I thought we had an exceptional day yesterday, really a very strong start to this symposium, and today is looking to be similarly engaging. We're going to begin with a session titled How Can Australia Improve Education and Health in a Constantly Changing World? And the session is extremely timely. If we didn't already know it, the pandemic has highlighted the critical importance of having strong and robust health and education systems. And the session is going to look at those issues today. For those of us who have actually worked on projects relating to the impact of COVID-19, it's also become starkly clear, if we didn't already know it, that our education and health are very, very directly connected. Now, I think today, chairing the first session, we have Professor Pat McGorry. Is Pat here?
Yes, I'm here, Mark, yes.
Oh, that's great. I'm delighted to hear that, because otherwise I would be chairing the session. So just to introduce Pat, Patrick McGorry is an Australian psychiatrist known worldwide for his work in early intervention and youth mental health, and for mental health innovation, advocacy and reform. He's Executive Director of Origin and Professor of Youth Mental Health at the University of Melbourne. He conceived and he led the development of Headspace, the National Youth Enhanced Primary Mental Health Program, which is now in over 150 communities nationally. And he's played a key advocacy and advisory role in government and health systems. In 2010, Professor McGorry was named Australian of the Year. And in 2016, he became the first psychiatrist to be elected as a fellow to the Australian Academy of Science. So thank you, Pat.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to start off by saying that I'm on Wurundjeri land here in Melbourne, and well, I want to echo the acknowledgement of country that you've already made, and emphasise the lack of ceding of the lands. That's a very important point. So thank you for that. Good morning, everyone, and welcome. And it's a great privilege to chair this session, especially with the quality of the speakers that we have that we'll be hearing from this morning. It's really I'm really looking forward to it. This, as Mark said, is an absolutely critical issue, and in the area that I work in with young people, the interface between education and mental health is incredibly sort of powerful and under tremendous stress at the moment, as you probably all know. So very, very timely, as you say, Mark. So the format of the session is 4 15-minute presentations followed by a 15 to 20-minute Q&A. And if the audience could please type the questions into the Q&A box during the event, we'll do our best to monitor that and draw upon them and put them to the speakers. So it's my great pleasure to kick off with Professor Barry McGaw, who's a Professorial Fellow and Vice-Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Melbourne. Professor McGaw has served with peak national and international educational bodies such as the OECD, UNESCO, and the Australian Council for Educational Research. And Barry will be speaking on quality and equity in education, simultaneous pursuits or trade-offs. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Pat, very much. I chose these two topics because they are obviously important. They're of international interest, but they're also commitments that ministers for education in Australia take. Ministers meet regularly, and since 1989, once a decade, have made statements about shared goals, or common and agreed goals, as they first called them. And in terms of quality, they first committed to attainment, increasing the proportion of the population reaching various levels of education. But more recently, there's been a focus on achievement, both nationally and internationally. And those are the ones to which the ministers have committed themselves in each of their statements. Now, the OECD, which had produced lots of data on attainment, began collecting and publishing data on achievement in 2000. These are the results from the first survey in 2000. There's Australia. We made much of the fact that we apparently ranked 4th, but these boxes represent the performance of a sample of 15-year-olds. The line in the middle of the box is the mean of the sample. The box reflects the range within which the population mean of 15-year-olds is most likely to lie, and that's the parameter of interest, really. Where is the population? The New Zealand minister made much of the fact that they apparently beat Australia, but the fair way to describe this is that any country whose box overlaps Australia's box is not significantly different from Australia, so only Finland was ahead of us. And I think a proper way to describe the result is to say we tied for second. But what's happened since then? Well, PISA collects data every 3 years. PISA 2000, the main domain was reading. 2003 maths, 2006 science, 2009 back to reading, and 2018 back to reading. So we've got substantial data sets on those 3 occasions. And I want to just take some particular countries. That's what's happened to the OECD mean. located arbitrarily at 500 on the scale to begin with, the decline reflects a growth in the number of members of the OECD, with those joining by and large below the mean of those that were there initially. So that's a decline that's a function of the changed population. But look at the countries. Finland, the poster child in 2000, has declined quite rapidly. Canada has declined, Australia even more so. But here's one of interest, Poland. Now, what have they done that enabled them to produce that dramatic achievement? It's a rather nice example of an interrupted time series, because we know exactly what they did after 2000. And you can see it if you look at differences between schools. What we looked at initially was how much of the variation among students occurs within schools and how much occurs between schools. And these countries down the left-hand end, Belgium, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Poland, are all countries that make their secondary schools different by streaming students into them on the basis of their performance at the end of primary school, whereas the ones at the right-hand end, this mostly Scandinavian countries, have fully comprehensive schools with almost no difference between them. All the variation among students in those countries lies within schools. So there's Australia, and there's Canada and Finland, and there's Poland. Now, 3 years later, and I use the maths data from 2003 PISA, there's Australia, Canada, and Finland in roughly the same positions, but look at Poland now. And that's because the major reform in Poland was to stop streaming students into schools of different kinds, to render their schools comprehensive, and those data simply display that they did what they said they did. But the more interesting thing is that it produced the dramatic rise in achievements that you've seen in the, if I've shown you with the means, but I'll show it to you now in another way. There's the 2000 results. Now, these are the reading scale, where on the scale we defined zones according to the level of competence of the students in reading. This is level 5, a high level, down to the ones shown in red, below what was defined internationally as the minimum competence in reading for 15-year-olds. And look at Poland, you see very few high performers and a quite substantial tail. By 2018, Poland now looked like Finland and Canada, with a much larger proportion of high-performing students and a reduced proportion of lower-performing students, whereas Australia remained pretty much where it was, as you saw in our mean, with this long tail that we don't deal with so well. So that's the evidence on quality. The evidence on equity, the ministers talk about wanting to reduce the impact of socioeconomic disadvantage, to set higher expectations for Indigenous students, to reduce the influence of other sources of disadvantage, disability, homelessness, refugee status, and remoteness, and to have schools make a contribution to social cohesion. This is the language from the ministers. Now, that's the data from 2000. Again, that's 250,000 15-year-olds across the participating countries. And that distribution can be summarized by that regression line, a social gradient. The steeper the line, the less equitable the results. So a steep line would indicate that advantaged students, on average, have a considerable advantage in achievement over disadvantaged students on average. Now, the line's only a summary. There's lots of cases of advantaged students not performing so well and disadvantaged students doing well, but there's a reasonable correlation there. If you overlay that with some particular country data, you can see Finland's line, less steep than the OECD line. Australia's more nearly parallel. Germany's much steeper. Very controversial results in Germany that they were so inequitable in their results. Now, I could lay over many more countries' lines, but you wouldn't see the difference. So here's another way to display that. What I've done here is to put the horizontal line at the OECD mean. So any country above it is quality higher than the OECD mean. And here is a zero created as the difference between the slope of the OECD line and the country line. And if the country line is less steep than the OECD line, the result's a positive score, which puts them out in the right-hand side of the graph. And if this country line is more steep, that is less equitable, puts them to the left. If the name's in blue, they're significantly less steep than the OECD and thus significantly more equitable. And if they're in red, the other way around, significantly steeper and thus less equitable. So Canada and Finland in a quadrant that we could call high quality, high equity, whereas Australia, where we've seen the high quality, but it's in a quadrant that is properly described as high quality, low equity. At least we escaped the other two quadrants. High quality, low quality, high equity, and low quality, low equity. And it's interesting to see what's happened since then. I won't reproduce that precise graph. I'll take the top corner and expand it and show you the results for the three successive PISA data collections. Now look at Finland, 2000, 2009, 2018, declining in quality and declining in equity. Look at Canada, always comfortably in the top right-hand quadrant, always high quality, high equity. And Australia, high quality, low equity, 2000, and then 2009 and 2018, getting closer to the OECD mean. And Poland hasn't done much in terms of equity, but it certainly has improved its quality. Now, the other issue that the ministers say they're committed to is reducing or having schools contribute to social cohesion. We held a meeting of all the most senior officials in education ministries in the countries in preparation for a meeting of ministers in OECD. And we asked them, what are their main concerns? And it was quite amazing. Mostly all these old men said that they were worried about diminishing social cohesion, saying that most of the common experiences young people had when they were growing up had disappeared, with the one remaining common experience being school. And I remember pointing out to them that most of their countries' schools separate kids on the basis of gender, social class, faith, and so on. And that it's not school that's a shared experience, it's schooling. So by the time we had the ministers meet, we asked the question, can schooling unite when schools divide? We'd not long before that published a book on social capital that we called The Wellbeing of Nations. So I invited Robert Putnam to come to that ministerial meeting and to talk about his conceptions of social capital. Drawing on his work in Northern Ireland, for example, he'd established there was strong bonding social capital within the Protestant and Catholic communities, but very little bridging social capital between them. And when you think about schools that are socially divided, a school that serves a homogeneous, small community is well placed to build strong bonding social capital. But what could schools do to build bridging social capital? Now, there are a couple of examples in Australia. Oh, let me make one further point. The challenges I've implied, Canada, high quality, high equity. Canada has public and Catholic school districts, but they're all equally funded from taxation. And all of them have a sense of local control, not remote capital control. And Poland, as we've seen, has achieved its improvement in a national system through comprehensivization of the schools. There are some interesting Australian initiatives, starting in South Australia, co-locating of government and non-government schools on the same site. In the case of Golden Grove, a new community development, one secondary school site with 3 secondary schools, each entered from a different angle into the site, students wearing their local and their uniforms so that the badge of the school is retained. But between the schools, high quality, expensive upper secondary science facilities and CAD design facilities shared and timetabled for sharing among the schools. And also the schools collectively sharing hospitality resources with the local community located just outside the school boundary in local government land. The government systems have gone through various attempts to decentralize, the most recent being the creation of what are called independent public schools in Western Australia. And the initial evaluation of that revealed a quite positive impact. The attempts to balance up funding have been much more problematic. The two Gonski reports, in the modern way, 1.0 and 2.0, actually revealed considerable resistance from well-funded schools to any kind of redistribution. And to show you the extent of the differences, I've just picked off the My School site, a high-fee, independent, co-educational school in Melbourne with almost $35,000 per student, and a highly regarded government co-educational secondary school, only $14,500 a student. So the very remarkable differences in resources for our schools. So we're not doing all that well, actually, with education. Our quality is declining, our inequity is high and generally remaining so. And schooling in Australia is pretty resistant to reform. Schools contribute in large measure to social reproduction, and there's strong resistance to any reform that puts the advantage of the advantaged at risk. We've got a set of eggs it's very hard to unscramble. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Barry. That was very illuminating, and I think we learned a lot from listening to that. So we'll come back to the question and answer later. And moving on, it's my very great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Professor Richard Bryant, who's Scientia Professor of Psychology at the University of New South Wales and Director of the Traumatic Stress Clinic. He is a Fellow of the Academy of Science, and he's pioneered many aspects of post-traumatic stress disorder, including its development, assessment, and diagnosis. And he'll be speaking on the topic, ensuring good mental health during the pandemic and beyond. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you, Pat, and hello, everybody. And I'd like to thank the Academy for inviting me to give a talk in this wonderful series. And again, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on, which is the Gadigal people. So ensuring good mental health during the pandemic and beyond. Now, as Mark mentioned earlier, we all know what it's like being living through the pandemic. It's had a massive impact on every aspect of our lives, and mental health has been no exception. It's had an unprecedented impact on mental health globally. In all my years of working in this field, I've never seen such an explosion of research done. Many, many hundreds of studies reported around the world. And in terms of trying to comprehend what impact the pandemic's had on our mental health, what we are really learning from the most are the cohort studies. And by cohort, I mean population studies where they were looking at people before the pandemic, and then we've been able to look at how people are faring after the pandemic. And just to give you an idea of just how many of these studies have been done, here's just a figure of 36 studies, a combination of their results that tells us, and I think let's look mainly at anxiety and depression because they're the most common. Not all of the disorders encompass that, but they're the most common ones that have been occurring in the pandemic. And essentially, anxiety has gone up from 10% to about 25% in countries affected by the pandemic. And depression's gone up to about 20%. Now, these are phenomenal rates of mental health problems that we just haven't seen in populations before. And what this really means is that there are many people around the world who have really not had a mental health problem before and are really, during the pandemic, experiencing mental health issues, and they just haven't had to deal with this at any time in their lives. Now, the pandemic's not affecting everybody the same. This is another graph that sort of looks at A is referring to depression and B down the bottom is referring to anxiety. And you can see again that the rates are increasing, but the sort of the light pinkish shade there is the sort of increase during the pandemic. And we can see that who's mostly at risk there are the females. Now, we know across these common mental disorders, females are more at risk normally, and for a range of reasons, partly hormonal and partly other biological factors. But during the pandemic, women have been particularly hit hard. Many of them are playing the role of the primary caregiver, being the mother. Many are homeschooling, and women are often taking the brunt of things economically. But also we can see in these graphs the shift towards the younger people. It's the younger people and the young adults, they're really the ones that have been affected most in terms of their mental health during the pandemic. Older people tend to be more protected. Older people tend to have a greater economic buffer during times like this. And younger people also, it's a critical time of their lives in terms of academic and career development, relationship development, and being deprived of just social interactions during lockdown is particularly damaging to young people. And we've seen this in nearly every study that has been done. And what's interesting, if we look at the map globally, we can see that the increases in mental health problems is nearly a linear relationship with the degree of infections that are occurring in each country and also where the lockdowns are happening. And it's a very clear relationship between those patterns in the pandemic and what's been happening in terms of mental well-being. And also when we just look at the disability that's occurring as a result, again, we see the same pattern. It's in those younger people in particular. It's in anxiety and depression, significantly extra disability. And this is having a huge economic cost and a societal cost on people around the world, and particularly in countries that are least able to afford it, particularly low and middle income countries. So what all the data around the world is telling us is that anxiety and depression has increased hugely. About 1 in 4 people have got a mental health problem during the pandemic. About 1 in 10 are feeling suicidal. And that's a serious concern. Interestingly, suicide rates have not increased during the pandemic, despite initial warnings. But these things could still be occurring downstream. We don't know yet. But according to the recent modelling, it's estimated that so far in the pandemic, around the world, we've probably had 53 million cases more of depression and an additional 76 million cases of anxiety. And these are mind-boggling numbers. And it just tells you that the degree of the mental health cost that the world has been experiencing. And we've been feeling it here in Australia. Now, Australia, we've dodged some of the more severe mental health problems in terms of we've avoided the death rate and a lot of the trauma in terms of the scale of it that many parts of Europe, America, Asia has experienced. But we've still had a huge increase. And on numerous days this year, Lifeline, in its nearly 60-year history, has kept breaking records for daily number of calls for people in crisis. Now, of course, the question on everybody's lips is, when is it going to stop? And a lot of people have been thinking that when we actually have 90–95% vaccine rates, and when restrictions ease and the freedoms come back to everybody, that it's going to sort of flick a light switch and suddenly everyone's going to be feeling good again. But the data tells us that's not the case. If we look at previous pandemics, such as the SARS, we know that the elevated rates continued. And it's interesting if we look at countries that have been ahead of Australia in terms of their vaccine rollout and when they've been able to ease restrictions, they actually tell us that, yes, as people get more freedom back, mental health does improve somewhat, but it doesn't go back to pre-pandemic levels. And what we're seeing in those countries is that the suicidality, the anxiety and depression, loneliness, they're still staying at very high levels, much higher than before. And what really all the data is telling us is that even as we start to get more of a handle on the pandemic, and of course that's a big unknown in terms of new variants and what the next couple of years hold for us. But even the way things stand at the moment, there is no doubt that the mental health effects of the pandemic are going to be with us for years to come. It's going to be affecting some people more than others. It's going to be affecting young people, females, single parents, and what we really need to factor in here are the downstream economic factors. And I know that we keep hearing in Australia that our economy is rather robust, but what a lot of the data is now telling us that we really need to pay attention to is we shouldn't be looking at the overall average number. It's the subgroups within the community, within the population. These are the people who are not faring well. So we know within the pandemic, there's the unemployed, underemployed, casual workers, for example, have been faring very badly. Their plight in the future is not looking good. And so these people are particularly at risk in terms of mental health problems. And this is probably going to persist for some period of time moving forward. Now, what do we do to manage this? Let me tell you briefly about some work we've been doing over the last few years with the WHO, where we've been working with them to develop some brief mental health programs for people affected by adversity. And we sort of did this with the WHO because most countries in the world don't have mental health systems. They're not able to, have access to psychiatrists or psychologists, readily. So they need to come up with innovative ways to do it. And we've been working on this. And during the pandemic, we adapted some novel programs that we developed with the WHO. We came up with a program that we titled Coping with COVID. And it was based on evidence in terms of what we know works. It was simple strategies for learning how to manage anxiety, how to manage my worry, how to solve or manage my problems, how to sort of maintain positive events in my life despite the restrictions going on around me, and how to access social supports despite lockdown and quarantine, etc. And I want to emphasize that we just didn't put these programs together willy-nilly. They were based on a lot of very basic science work that has been going on for years in many labs, including mine, that justify why we put these programs together. Social support is one good one. It's absolutely something that's been rocked during the pandemic, but it's a key example of a psychological mechanism that's hardwired in us. And it actually is something that's hardwired across species. This is the sort of study that we would do in our lab. We would get people to come in, we would take stress hormone indicators via their saliva. We would stress people by sinking their arms into icy cold water for 3 minutes, which is a very painful exercise. And then we would just very briefly prime them with a reminder of their attachment figure, a support figure, a romantic partner, a family member, or another person who's really more of a stranger. And then we can look at their stress levels later. And what we found across many studies is that we can actually, by a very brief prime of a social support figure, we can reduce their stress in terms of their hormonal readings. Or similarly, we can actually look at something like their parasympathetic response using the same sort of paradigm. We can measure this through heart rate variability. And again, we can find that we can increase parasympathetic response, which is the capacity of a person to be able to calm down after a stressor, by simply having brief access to a social figure. And so we sort of built these sort of programs into our pandemic program. And what we did was we set it up as a small group program, 4 people in a group. We had to do it by video conferencing because of lockdown. And it meant we could actually disseminate this across Australia, even to remote and regional parts of the country. It was a simple session, 6-session program, so it was very cost effective. And we've done a couple of trials now in Australia looking at this program. And in the first one, we recruited 240 people, and they either got the Coping with COVID program, or we gave them the same skills, but they did it via self-help in a self-paced way. And essentially, we followed people up at various time points up to 6 months after the program. And it worked quite well. Essentially, we found that 6 months later, people were having markedly less depression and markedly less anxiety. So it does seem to work well. And we're doing this now with other programs, trying to sort of augment them with app programs and other means as a way of disseminating this sort of intervention. But we shouldn't get too excited. We've got a lot more to do. We're doing new trials at the moment in India, Spain, Italy, and other parts in Europe, because they've got completely different mental health issues. The death rates are very high, so grief and PTSD is very, very prevalent. They're harder to treat. But I think the point that I'd like to make here is that if we're really going to try to deal with these millions of people around the world who have mental health problems, we've got to get down to the fundamentals of psychological science. We've got to understand what are the basic ingredients that we can actually take from that, because we have to come up with ways that are dissemination friendly, that are scalable and that are affordable, because in a well-resourced country like Australia, we can actually deal with our need rather well. But there's a lot of countries like India and Asia and Africa where the mental health problems are huge. They don't have mental health services. The effects of the pandemic are going to be long-term. And I just want to emphasize that it's not just the pandemic. As we know in Australia, we have disasters at a regular period, and we do all around the world. In the wake of Glasgow, we know that climate change is ever ongoing and having a huge impact on mental health because of disasters. And we do need these sort of evidence-driven programs if we're really going to try to sort of mitigate the mental health costs of these events. Okay, I will stop there and back to you, Pat.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Well, I really enjoyed your talk, and I suppose before we move on, I just make one quick comment that I think it's a rosy view of Australia to think that we've got mental health services that are fit for purpose. We've just had Royal Commissions in Victoria, and the surge of need that you just pointed to is just completely overwhelmed the system now. So waiting lists are just blown out to many, many months, and you know, even affluent and middle class Australians cannot get mental health care, let alone the disadvantaged people. So we've got a very serious crisis, and it has to be a key building block and pillar of the recovery from COVID in our country too, not just in India and countries with much more serious problems. So
you're absolutely right, Pat. You're absolutely right.
Thanks a lot. And hopefully we can have some discussion about that a bit further down the track. But thank you for a great presentation as always. Moving on, we've got a double act coming up now, which is Karen Fisher and Perry O'Shea. Karen is a professor of the Social Policy Research Centre, and her research interests are in the organisation of social services in Australia and China, disability and mental health policy, inclusive research and evaluation, and social policy process. And Dr. Perry O'Shea is a respected leader in the mental health sector, and her research work draws on her own lived experience, which is obviously incredibly important in mental health care, and qualitative research skills to facilitate participation of people with lived experience of mental health challenges by supporting them to engage in research and co-design processes. Again, something very, very important and much more prominent these days. So Karen and Perry, over to you, and looking forward to hearing you speak.
Thanks very much, Patrick. So we're going to speak today about valuing diversity as a strength in how we build social equality, how we do our policies. And the reason we've chosen this topic is we were invited to talk about the future of policy. We're going to focus on the how of policy rather than the what. So I'll begin by speaking, and Perry will come up do the second half for us. Thank you. So over the last couple of decades, there's been quite a change in the type of social questions that we ask and how we ask those questions. There are two main changes that we want to focus on today. One is the increasing use of a human rights framework in social policy to understand what those questions are. And then secondly, inclusive policy methods to understand how to ask those questions and how to try and resolve them. They're both changes that seem to me fairly obvious, and I'm sure to many of you too. And of course, what we see instead is a lot of resistance to the implementation of these type of changes or the implications from these changes. And that's what we're going to explore today. So looking first at a human rights framework, what we've found in our research and with the government people that we work with is one of the advantages of adopting a human rights framework to understand social policy questions is that it's both intuitive and has legal status. So even young children understand and use the words of fairness and equity and calling for justice in our daily lives. And what's interesting in the last couple of decades is the public and government confidence in making these claims to equity and justice, rather than just thinking of social policy questions as welfare or charity or being nice to people. A human rights framework gives us a way of understanding people's personal, social, and structural disadvantages, the very basis of social science concepts. Human rights are often criticised in social sciences, however, as being individual focused. But I think a more sophisticated understanding of human rights frameworks is that rights are relative, that they're interrelational with the people that we're with, the communities we're in, and the society we belong to. So human rights can be thought of as collective rights, as responsibilities within our social context. And we've seen a lot of debate on this recently around the COVID vaccine rights and responsibilities. They vary by place and by time. The other advantage of human rights frameworks, though, is that they are often very clearly articulated in law and policy. So we have normative standards that we can call upon. In Australia, that means that we're signatories to many of the UN Convention on Rights. Some states have the benefit of bills of rights, and we all are subject to discrimination law. So although these laws and policies are criticised as often unenforceable because of access and cost, what they do give us is an expected standard against which we can make claims. And members of the public and the government in articulating and reforming policy make recall to these claims. So I'll turn now to some examples of how we use this framework to inform future policy change. In our area of mental health and disability policy research, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2006 has given us a shared language on words and concepts for government, for public, and for the community in terms of making human rights arguments about the consequences of inequity from the way that our society and our social policy systems are organised. So as an example, the large research program led by Julian Troller at my University of New South Wales about people with intellectual disability and mental health quite explicitly applies this human rights framework, very basic rights around rights to life, rights to health, and rights to access and services. By using this framework, we are able to illustrate the fairness and equity or otherwise of the way that health services are organised. And Julian Troller's work demonstrates that people with intellectual disability and mental health needs are likely to die 27 years earlier because of the inequity in the way that our policy and service systems fail to address a person's social and structural circumstances. These are not differences because of a person's body. They are differences because we fail to meet their rights in the society in which they live. A second example of how we use a human rights framework is restrictive practices in mental health services. The National Mental Health Consumer and Carer Forum advocated from about 2009 around the reduction of restrictive practices, and were able to very starkly compare this to the rights in the Convention Against Torture in 1987. And so people didn't argue against this, and the government was able to fund the National Mental Health Commission for an initiative from 2011 to reduce restrictive practices. Fortunately, by now, most states and territories have at least agreed in principle that we need to minimise restrictive practices, and many have the policies and laws to implement that. But of course, the challenge is actually overcoming resistance in the way that our systems are organised so that we implement those changes, which requires changes in culture and changes in who has power over who. The implications then of using a human rights framework for future policy is that it helps us to frame questions, to the process to ask the questions, and gives us new opportunities for points of change. The government and policy use the language of human rights in service systems and are more and more confident in doing that. As I've shown, the challenge is now to change the inequality in the way that our social service systems and structures are organised and implementing those changes. It requires redesign of our service systems to address the needs of our diverse population, recognising everybody's rights, not just the imaginary average person. And that then, of course, means that we need to speak to the people who are affected by those rights. So I'll now hand to Perry to complete our presentation.
Hi, before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge I'm on Dharawal land in southeast Sydney, and also acknowledge people that have an lived experience of marginalisation and discrimination, and those that love and care for us. So the second thing we want to talk about today, second change, is around social inclusion or inclusive policies more widely. So it's really important and that we include people when there's complex social questions, that people with lived experiences, that their experience and the knowledge that they hold is actually harnessed and used in research and in policy development. And we have seen a big shift towards inclusive policy and research methods over probably the last 30 or so years, particularly in terms of gender, sexuality, and more recently disability, but also First Nations people. And what I want to talk about particularly today is disability and mental health, which is also more recent and still a little bit contestable, I guess, to some extent. So, so some of the ways that we are seeing examples of inclusive policy and research is through employment. And in the mental health example, for instance, there's now quite a strong lived experience research, engagement of people that have a lived experience through, advisory groups, engagement through in governance of certain sorry, just changed the slide, Karen. We finished that one. I said enough on that, did I? Okay. So basically, what we're actually looking at when we talk about exclusion is the expertise of what the experience is like for highly disadvantaged people and groups, people that are marginalised and discriminated, as I talked about a minute ago. And so it's actually expertise that is different from the expertise of an academic or an expertise of a policymaker or a clinician. And so it needs to be part of looking when we look at complex social questions. Also, inclusive policy and research actually shifts that power and control over who asks the question, and also who decides the policy answer. And that in itself is extremely powerful. It actually, it makes us ask different questions. It makes us think about things in different ways. So And what we're talking about is genuine participation of people that have other capacity. So it might be children, people with cognitive disability, mental health, criminal justice. Now you can change the slide, sorry, Karen. So in the mental health example, we have come a long way in the last 20 years or so. In the government tenders usually require inclusive methods, particularly I think in research projects or government tenders around research or evaluation. It's expected if we're working with people with a disability or mental health or First Nations people or any particular group, those people with lived experience are involved in the design of that research. We actually, as I talked about already, the mental health sector employs people with mental health needs, and talking about our own project, we employ people with intellectual disability and mental health needs when we're doing a research project or an evaluation project, where they are the focus. And what we have found in our projects that it does change the design, the conduct and the analysis of the research, which has been really, really important and a big learning curve I personally have a lived experience of mental illness. I don't have a lived experience of disability, intellectual disability, but I'm a carer of a person that does. But still it was a learning curve for me because my experiences, not everybody's experiences are the same. And just the way that we talk about things, the way we write things down, it actually has changed. It demonstrates to governments and service providers not only that the value of meaningfully engaging with people, but also is a huge benefit to policy change. And there's also been a benefit to practice. So we go out with people and we might conduct a focus group or an interview, and it changes how that clinician or that policymaker actually thinks about people with an intellectual disability and a mental illness, and how they rethink about how they actually work and talk to people. And it comes with little cost and effort. It probably should come with more cost because still there's some inequities there in terms of remuneration and so on. But some of these things that people with lived experience of mental illness bring to the table are just little things that can change in policy and practice that other people haven't thought of because they don't have a lived experience. Karen, you can change it to slide. So they ask questions in different ways. They have they have different options and different priorities to people that don't have that lived experience. As I talked about already, when they're in the room, the language and concepts change. They usually become more respectful. Most people that work in this sector want to be respectful, but they don't often realize that how they might be talking or acting or doing things is actually not respectful to a person that has a lived experience until a person with lived experience explains that. And also it does mean that policymakers and researchers are forced to question their own assumptions. But this is not all rosy and wonderful. The sharing power and decision making is really difficult. It's really difficult if you've spent many years in a professional position where it's part of your identity and what you do to actually to share that power in the decision making, or sometimes in the mental health space that maybe perhaps some of the ways that you've been working with people has not been the most beneficial for those people, even though you come from a place of caring. And as Karen talked about, and I think Pat talked about too, like it's not just about changing policy. The harder bit is often changing that implementation for these things to happen on the ground. It does result in changes in instruction and processes and government services and university, but it can only happen when we actually recognise and work with people's direct experience expertise and how important that expertise is. And take that all the way back to the ground to be able to implement. But people with lived experience, when that happens, we'll be able to initiate and lead policy change for our future. I don't know, do you want me to sum up, Karen, or?
I think that's a good place to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Karen and Perry, very, very much. It resonated very, very strongly with me, your talk. It's really, resonates with what I've found in my career too. Certainly working with young people, they've been an indispensable sort of influence on the systems that we've developed. And the human rights bit too, Karen, and that was very, very big inspiration for me in my career in mental health too. So thank you both. I really enjoyed that talk. So moving on, it's my great pleasure now to introduce Professor Stephen Duckett, who he's recently stepped down from this role as director of the Health and Aged Care Program at Grattan Institute and moving on to greener pastures, or even greener pastures, I'd say. And Stephen has a reputation for great creativity, evidence-based innovation, and pretty fearless views as well. I think very cutting-edge sort of views on a whole range of issues in the health sector. And it extends from areas ranging from introduction of activity-based funding for hospitals to new systems of accountability for safety in hospital care. And he was an inspiration, I think, and a catalyst for the Royal Commission that I mentioned earlier in Victoria into mental health care in Victoria, which has been a transformational process. So thank you, Stephen, for all those reasons. And over to you.
Thanks very much, Pat. And I'd start by acknowledging that where I sit here at home is the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And the topic of today's symposium is how can Australia improve education and health in a constantly changing world? And I decided to think about that because in a way, looking at history, I distinctly remember having a meeting and someone said, look, I've just come into this new role in the health sector and I've been out of the health sector for 20 years or 10 years or whatever it was, and nothing has changed. And I thought, well, is this a real problem, and are we doomed to keep repeating the problems of yesterday rather than moving on to the problems of tomorrow? Next slide, please. And so I started by looking back at the Commission of Inquiry into the Efficiency and Administration of Hospitals, which was done in the early 1980s. It was chaired by a guy called Jim Jamieson. And so next slide, please, or next transition, please. So the first thing to notice is this is a Commission of Inquiry into hospitals. And I guess nowadays we wouldn't ever have a Commission of Inquiry into hospitals. You'd only have a Commission of Inquiry into health, something I'll come back to. Next slide, please. Or next transition. And these are the recommendations that came out of that inquiry. So the first one was the role of the Commonwealth as a provider of funds must be clearly defined. In providing funds, the Commonwealth must lay down conditions which have meant if funding is to continue. And I think that is now being implemented through the introduction of activity-based funding. And I'll just skip on to the next transition. And the provision of efficient health services must be the responsible states, which is hospitals. Next transition, please. The procedures for providing funds from the Commonwealth to states and from the states to the hospitals must be changed to ensure that funds are spent according to need. Of course, this is a very common statement in the health sector, that need is a highly contested concept. But next transition, to some extent, there's a movement to value-based care. But if we mean by need a national efficient price, that is, the payment is related to some sort of measure of efficiency, then that is happening. Next transition, management cost information must be developed. That's certainly the case. We've got a national hospital cost data collection. Next transition, please. Provision of health services must be seen by the parliaments to be responsible and accountable. I think that's true. And next transition, please. We should basically abolish private health, Medicare, and have everybody pay everything towards their own healthcare, which of course was not introduced. Rather, in 1984, we reintroduced the Universal Health Insurance Scheme, now known as Medicare. So basically, if you look at this and look at the ones which are, in a sense, technocratic in their orientation, they're more or less all been introduced. So the problems that were identified in the 1980s don't seem to be the problems of 2020. Next slide, please. The next inquiry to look at, next slide, please, is the National Health and Hospital Commission, which was appointed by the Rudd government, whose signature is nicely there on the cover of the report I have. And importantly, it was an inquiry into health, not hospitals. Next transition, please. And what it says here is that while the Australian health system has many strengths, it is a system under growing pressure, which is probably the case even more today with COVID. Next transition. We face significant challenges, including large increases in demand for and expenditure on healthcare, which is the same today as it was back in a decade ago when that report, just more than a decade ago when that report was released. Next transition, please. Unacceptable inequities in health outcomes and access to services. And I gave that rote introduction acknowledgement of country at the start of my presentation. Didn't mention to you that still First Nations Australians have a life expectancy of a decade shorter than white Australians. So we still have that. Next transition, please. They also recognise growing concerns about safety and quality. Next transition, workforce shortages, which are still evident today, especially in rural and remote Australia, and especially in primary care. Next transition, and inefficiency. Next transition. Further, we have a fragmented health system with complex division of funding responsibilities and performance accountabilities between different levels. Government is ill-equipped to respond to these challenges. Next transition. I think the only one that, next transition, the only one where we have seen demonstrable improvement has been the growing concerns about safety and quality of hospital care. Obviously, we have those problems in aged care in spades. So the transition, so when we look at the report from a decade ago, we've still got much the same sort of problems. And that's, as I said, just a decade ago. So it doesn't have the benefits of the 40 years since the Jamieson inquiry. So we may well still be doomed to reflect the problems of yesteryear. Next transition, please. So why haven't we progressed, and what are the barriers for progress? Next transition. I think the first one is what I call the accounting identity. It's also Uwe Reinhardt, one of late Uwe Reinhardt, a great economist, and Bob Evans, Canadian health economist, have both talked about, which is that every dollar of health spending is a dollar of someone's incomes or sales. And so, you know, trying to change anything in the health sector is all about changing the distribution of incomes, and that's always pretty tricky. Next transition. And it's made even more tricky by what I call the stakeholder management, which is all about stakeholders successfully describing grabs for more income and power as selfless, or successfully shifting cost to poorer, less powerful groups. And these two, of course, go together. Next slide. Next transition, please. Very often, the people in the health sector complain about Commonwealth-state relations, and you saw that in the conclusions of the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission. And of course, there's the old joke about, next transition, please, the United Nations Commission on the Elephant, where they set up this commission to look at the future of the elephant. And so the South African delegation prepared a paper on the elephant, the impact of colonial exploitation on the elephant. The Swedes put in a paper on the elephant and sex. The French put in a paper on eating the elephant, and another country a coalition of countries put in a report on imperialism. And the Australian delegation put in a paper on the elephant, a Commonwealth or state issue. That is, we see everything in terms of Commonwealth state, when in reality, next transition, please, the problem is not Commonwealth-state relations, next transition. The problem is a lack of sophistication in the management of the reality that Australia is a federation. We've just got to get over it. As Jackie Lambie said yesterday, be an adult next transition. And that means the states and health services have to learn to understand the potential of activity-based funding, next transition. And one of the problems is the state's failure to realise the potential of primary health networks, with New South Wales and Western Australia being honourable exceptions. And they fail to realise that potential because they see the PHNs as a Commonwealth issue and a declaration of interest. I chair the board of a PHN next transition. And of course, the Commonwealth's failure to create an authorising environment for states to use PHNs. Next transition. And part of the problem, I think, also is that you really rely on ministers and health ministers to create environments, including the authorising environments I've just referred to, for change. And some ministers are really seriously interested in policy change, and some ministers are really interested in political credit. And the other issue is how we think of change. Next slide, please. So dealing first with the issue of transition. So here we have a number of, next slide, please. We can arrange, next transition, we can arrange our ministers on the extent to which they're desperately interested in the politics, next transition, and to next transition, and the extent to which they're desperately interested in policy change. Next transition. And if I go back over the last couple of decades, next transition, we have Nicola Roxon, who was very strongly interested in policy change, signature policy being that of tobacco labelling, and signature, she also led the implementation of the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission reforms. And so she was successful on both the politics and also on really being strongly policy oriented. Her successor as minister, next slide, was Tanya Plibersek, who I've put there. She only was minister for a year or so. She did some major reform to the pharmaceutical benefit scheme, but so she got somewhere on policy and somewhere on politics. Next transition, please. Her successor as minister was Peter Dutton, who I've put there as being strongly policy oriented. He advocated changes to the MBS, changes which I totally opposed, but basically he had a vision, I think a flawed one, but he had a vision for policy. He was totally unsuccessful in achieving it, so I put him down on the negative side of politics. Next slide, please. We had his successor was Susan Lee, who actually started doing some reform. She set up the Medicare review, for example, but nothing came of that during her tenure. Next transition. And then we had Greg Hunt, who has basically not led any policy reform in his time. And I've put him as strong on politics there, next transition, but perhaps he's not strong on politics because it's so overt, the politicisation of the Medical Research Future Fund and the politicisation of the PBS, for example, being the two outstanding examples. And next transition, and this is Senator Colbeck, the Minister for Aged Care. The least said about him, the better. Next transition. There are, of course, also how we think of change is important. And there are actually two dimensions of change. Next transition, please. The first is scale, where when I talked about policy in that previous slide, I talked about big, large-scale changes as being the hallmark of change. Next transition, please. But we also need to think about the pace of change. Next transition, and the choice is either gradual change or simultaneous change. And the tobacco labelling, for example, was a big bang change, large and simultaneous. But that is not the only form of change which is important. Large-scale change can occur gradually. If you have a blueprint for change that over the next couple of decades, we're going to try and achieve these changes and work towards them, that can be just as important as the big bang simultaneous change. Next slide, please. So if we're to address that next transition, please, we need to expose the rent seeking, next transition. So what I talked about earlier was the accounting identity and the stakeholder magic, but here we need to actually call out the barriers to change. And I think there's a role for academics and independent think tanks like the Grattan Institute here. And of course, I would say that, wouldn't I? Next transition, please. We also need to open our eyes to the opportunities of blueprint change rather than the solely thinking about healthcare change as big bang change. Next transition, we need to be in it for the long haul. And so, for example, the introduction of activity-based funding in Victoria in 1993 was all about changing the dynamics of the relationship between the health department and the hospitals and changing the objective function for hospitals so that they themselves had an interest in pursuing efficiency and also, as it turned out, reducing waiting lists. Next transition. And the next we have to think about is, if we're in it for the long haul, is to think about to invest in the structures and incentives so that we put in place structures which themselves will be an engine of change over time. The National Health Reform Commission recommended the establishment of the National Health Performance Authority, the National Preventive Health Agency, both of which were subsequently abolished. In my review of quality and safety in Victoria, I recommended the introduction of the establishment of what is now Safer Care Victoria and the Victorian Agency for Health Information. Next transition, please. This thinking of investing in structures and incentives were core to the approach we adopted in the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission, what we call the grit in the oyster approach, that you have an oyster and you put one piece of sand, and over time, over a long period of time, it leads to significant change in the health system. Next transition, please. We also need to think about how do we expand bureaucratic mindsets about the limits of federation constraints so that we just don't keep saying Commonwealth-state relations, but rather we recognise that we have agency in this. Next transition, please. Of course, one of the issues is, coming back to the politics and policy issue, helping good ministers and constraining bad ones. Next transition. There's a role for academics and independent think tanks here, although we just can't admire the problem. And next transition, we've got the same issue that, of course, we want to be in the change for the long haul. So what I've tried to say here is to go back and say, we know there are problems. Those problems were recognised in the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission a decade ago. We've got many of the same problems today. So why haven't we changed? What do we need to do differently? And I've identified here how we can identify some of the barriers to change to get to a new health system and make sure our health system of tomorrow is better than the health system of yesterday. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for that fantastic overview of the problems and some of the possible solutions. So now that's the formal presentations part of the morning over. We have, I think, about a 15-minute opportunity for Q&A. So do we have any questions or comments from people in the audience? Just can't see any yet.
So Pat, there's one question in the Q&A box, and we'll encourage others to use that function to type questions to the audience.
Right. Okay. Sorry, I was looking at the chat rather than the Q&A. Thanks. I found it now. Yeah. So the question is from an anonymous attendee. I would love to hear Barry's response to this story today in the Sydney Morning Herald, which is about. It's entitled "A Complex Problem. Richest schools claim most HSC disability provisions. The high cost of providing disability provisions, including up to 1/3 of students at wealthy schools, is covered by the New South Wales Education Standards Authority." So, Barry, have you got a comment there?
Yes, I saw the question, and I did follow the link to the article which I read. It's an interesting one. It's the provision of extra time in examinations, additional support, maybe a reader for students who've got a proven need for such. And the point made is that there's a surprising extent to which the resources for this go to the wealthy schools. And what's the reason for that? Are they rorting the system, or are the public schools not able to properly use the system to get the resources that their students need? And the article runs the argument both ways. Former CEO from the authority said that her feeling was that many of the government schools who have students in need simply don't know how to manage the system. So it's interesting. It's a very interesting question, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Barry. There's another question now for Stephen, and I might add to it, actually. The question is from Diane Gibson. What grit would Stephen recommend putting into the oyster of aged care policy? And I'd say the same in mental health. And I'm not sure I can wait for an oyster to produce, decades in decades time mental health reform. We sort of need perhaps a more urgent strategy as well. But what would you say the grit would be, Stephen?
So answering Diane's question first, Pat, I think there's two. One is data, and that is better data and transparency of data. There was a bill in the Senate a couple of years ago which said we ought to publish how many staff residential aged care facilities have, and that was defeated by a coalition of, surprisingly, providers who thought there was no particular reason why consumers ought to know how many staff they had. So I think transparency of better data and transparency of data about quality, data about service provision and so on. Secondly, and a component and related to that is better stewardship, better oversight. The Royal Commission on Aged Care was very critical of the existing oversight mechanisms, including the Commission on Quality, Aged Care Quality, and the department. And so I think you either have to go for an independent aged care authority or local aged care regional stewardship arrangements, local oversight. But the combination of poor data and poor oversight is a recipe for disaster. The mental health problem, I think, is a slightly different one. The solutions that the mental health sector has often advocated over the last 20 years have been twofold. One is a cargo cult mentality, that if you have a national mental health plan, somehow that will magically make a difference. And if you look back over the mental health, I think we're now in the 6th mental health plan. Pat would know better than I. And there certainly has been improvement, but I think we've had more words written than centimetres of improvement. So I think, again, we need to, in the case of the National Health and Hospital Reform Commission, we had structures and incentives, and we should have, I said in my slide, should have added data in my slide. We've got very poor measurement of mental health needs, or rather the extent to which mental health needs are being met. We know, for example, there are long waits for people to get proper care when they front up at an emergency department, but we don't have that regularly published to us in the same way have elective surgery waiting lists, for example. So there's a diminishing of the ability for us, to the public, to know how bad things are. And so that not only applies in the very severely mentally ill issue, the turning up an emergency department, but right across the spectrum.
Thanks.
So I'm probably naive to say data fixes everything, but I think that
I totally agree with that last comment. The waiting lists are deliberately hidden in mental health by raising the bar with the criteria for access to the services, so you actually hide the need, deliberately hide it. That's what's been happening in state-funded services, and of course we've seen waiting lists blow out hugely since the pandemic kicked in. The only national policy plan since the first national mental health policy and plan in the early 90s that's been any good has been that National Hospital and Health and Hospital Reform Commission that the Rudd government set up. That had some great initiatives in that, but it just sort of didn't continue. And we've had really just pieces of paper really. And the big problem is a lack of understanding of the scale of the problem. We're funding it at about half the level it needs to be funded, and the integration of the system is very poor. So I think those are the key issues, but in long term, and that segues into the next question for you, and then we'll move to another one for Barry.
Sorry. Perry, yes, had her hand
sorry.
I was just going to say something about the mental health as well, because when
Stephen sorry, I didn't see that. Go ahead. Yeah.
When Stephen was talking, I agree that as we talked about already, it's lots been written, but implementation is an issue. But I was just thinking about that oyster metaphor, and definitely the consumers have been the grit in the oyster. But I think you have to remember that the metaphor also means that you end up with a pearl. So
yeah, that's a great point, Perry. Thank you for jumping in and making that point. That's great. Okay, just Stephen, how do we encourage policymakers to think long term? That's a big one.
Can I also just comment on Perry's point? The engagement of consumers has not only been at the policy national strategic level, but also at the local health service level. And consumers' lived experience has been really validated in many health services. And when I was at the Alfred Psychiatry had a very strong consumer lived experience. And that is an area where the mental health sector has been so far ahead of the general health sector, where consumers are still not given the voice and recognition that they deserve. How do you make public servants think more long term? I don't know the short answer to that. I guess it's partly, if I use my career as an example, I was an advocate for activity-based funding for a long time, and was told directly by two of my supervisors not to actually work on it at all. Being a good public servant, I entirely ignored them and just continued working on it and developed the infrastructure that was required. So quietly working along in the background, recognising that one day the time would come, and indeed one day the time would come. Now, I don't recommend that everybody ignores their supervisors, but I mean, it is an issue of being committed into the long term and recognising that eventually the time will come for major reform of the kind that is necessary.
Yeah. Just on the comment on about consumers, I've been trying to set up for some years, and it's sort of starting to get momentum now, a social movement called Australians for Mental Health, which is inclusive of both people with lived experience of mental illness and their families, as a sort of a very large scale, hundreds of thousands of people is the goal, to really, a bit like what happened with that led to the NDIS being set up. So it's impossible to ignore politically. I think that's the grit and the real. It's a massive oyster, perhaps, with a huge pearl at the end of it. But that's just as an aside. Now, Sue Richardson has a question for Barry. Do you think that the Golden Grove Initiative is likely to A, improve educational achievement overall, and B, increase bridging social capital? Barry.
Yes, thanks, Sue. There's not been much of an evaluation of that program, though it was transported interstate to Caroline Springs in Melbourne and to Springfield in Brisbane. It seems to have languished now. In Golden Grove, there were 4 primary school sites. Each of them had one government school and one non-government school. And in one case, they shared nothing than the playing fields. But in another case, they shared the staff rooms. And so it depends how much interaction you would get, actually, talking about what the schools are doing, what they're valuing, how they're working, would influence the benefits that might emerge. I would expect more benefit in terms of social capital necessarily than achievement, because that's the whole point of taking what might otherwise be isolated communities and their children and having them structurally interacting with others. That's the benefit, but sadly it's not been well enough evaluated.
Thank you. Now, there's one from, I think it's Erica Fish. In talking about change, I was curious, no one talked about our very human beingness. We are a society that's unable to connect with itself, and it's reflected in our mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical well-being, which is taking its toll on our country as well as globally. I feel we need to change our language and the way we see who we really are. That is, we are human souls which need to be cared for. This is how we stay balanced and happy. Could you please comment on this? Thank you. Just reminds me of that book by Johan Hari about lost connections, which touches on a lot of those issues. So over to the panel. That's a very deep question.
Maybe I could answer that. Thanks, Patrick. Thank you very much, Erica. And that's exactly the reason why in our presentation we were speaking about the very important need to recognise and listen to the range of expertise and knowledges. Unless we are prepared to hear other concepts, other ideas, and bring them into mainstream questions, then we have no way of answering those questions. So it's a great summary, thank you.
And probably the one that we're going to have to finish on, Anna tells me, or Isabel tells me. So I'm going to have to wind up, but I very quickly just thank all the speakers. I think covered some very, very key topics here and with some great wisdom and experience. So thank you all very, very much. And thanks to the participants. It looks like we had a great rollout or turn up, and hopefully it was very enjoyable for everyone listening. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.